So, I believe that we are finally ready to get started. As you have, I guess you've seen, this room was basically dedicated for management practices and so on. So it was like since 8:30 this morning that in this kind of room we are talking about CTOs and stuff. And this is the case for my talk as well. So, yeah, I mean, in the end, talks are always the same. So disclaimer, speaker, and so on and so forth, usual stuff. Then a little bit of recap about what startups are, as well as going forward with a mental model in case you want actually to launch your own startup. Which kind of technologies should you use, and these kind of questions. Finally, we will go deep in taking a look at native development, which is kind of a peculiar case of development as a whole. And finally, wrapping up with the technical debt. I hope we will have some room for question and answers, but yeah, we'll see. I'm basically Gianluca Segato everywhere. I'm Italian. I'm living in Berlin, though, since a few years already. I'm the founder and CEO, actually, so I'm not a CTO, which is quite ironic given the topic of this talk. But anyway, we are using data in order to make the journey of university students through college into the job market basically less stressful. We raised north of 600,000 euros so far from investors. And we are Berlin-based, but we are actually a remote team. So what we talked today from other speakers resonated quite well with me. I have an economics background, so I studied economics actually during university. But I code since at least 10 years, something like that. So I'm actually more a developer rather than an economist. And I blog. I mean, I started this kind of crazy journey, so you can bash me on Twitter, but I usually write on this website, so you can check it out. Disclaimers, this is not really a tech talk. It's more like a cross between technology and finance and business, but I really wanted to have the opportunity to talk about this overlap between these two worlds, because when you are a chief technology officer, then in that case, you are a manager, you're not a developer. So I believe that it should be discussed if you are a dev. Not much code will be shown, actually nothing, I guess. And Google will come basically at the end of the talk, so you are still in time to, I believe there are some Firebase stuff in other rooms, so you can leave if you want. I won't, I'm not gonna get angry. Anyway, still, I'm a nerd. So, just FYI, this has been written in Markdown, and this is solarized color scheme, so I tried to put some code in this regard. Still, check it out, it's super amazing. I mean, kill PowerPoint. Anyway, it always starts, with the same thing. I have an idea. Either it's a friend of yours that comes to you. It happened to me quite some time. Look, I have an idea for a new app. You can code, you can be my developer, and I'm gonna do whatever, right? And it's always the case, and you're like, yeah, I code, and you do what? And basically the conversation stops there. But let's assume that your friend is actually a great guy. He has or she has a great connections with, I don't know, finance world, whatever, and you actually get on board. Or maybe you got money from your company to bootstrap a new company or a new product, whatever. Or, I mean, that's actually what happened to me. This last point, you started a petty project just because you didn't know how to spend your weekends. And then in the end, it just scaled without any kind of control. And then you are like, yeah, probably this can be a company. And now, congratulations, you're a CTO. Now what, right? Just to be on the same page. What are startups? Just to get in the thinking of a CEO, because CEOs from time to time they're making these crazy decisions, and you as a developer or as a manager, a dev manager, you're like, what is going on? So just to be on the same page, startups are like usually, hopefully, like 1% of the time, $1 billion company in the making. And this means basically getting money from other people and trying to scale as fast as you can. So, spoiler, agencies are not startups. Startups are product companies, and they are taking money from investors, and they are scaling. In 5 years, hopefully getting to 100, 500, 1 billion average revenues per year. So, these investors are called venture capitalists, and before actually giving you the money, they want to see proof that you can be this $1 billion company, at least in theory, at least best case scenario. And the problem is, what is this kind of proof? You are building a product, you are developing an app. What do these guys want to see? Long story short, they want to see traction. They want to see that someone out there is actively using your product, either buying it or even just using it. I mean, think of, I don't know, any kind of social app. At some point, they started for free, and then they tried to monetize. But I mean, in the end, the traction is not really about revenues, it's about the world cares about you. And the world means many people. However, usually, otherwise you're not a startup, you have no idea how to prove this kind of traction. What should you do? And also, you have to move fast. You have to run quite fast. Otherwise, you're going to get screwed, basically. And now you can ask why. Why should it go fast? Why should I iterate? I know perfectly well my specifications of my product. And this is quite, understandable. And I reason as well like this. But then you discover that, unfortunately, as a startup, you are either trying to do something that no one can do, and therefore you have no idea as well, or on the other hand, it's a pretty interesting market, and then there are like 50 others that are competing for the same users. Actually, you're doing both. This was the Lambda School founder that maybe some of you knows about them. They're quite good. Long story short, you have no idea what you're going to do. You have no idea how to build your product, and probably there are like 50 others that are trying to compete for your same audience, your same customers, your same investors, whatever. So you need to keep things simple, because otherwise you cannot change. You have to make assumptions and change them, and basically rewrite everything from scratch all over again. Do that extremely fast, and at some point, maybe you can raise some more money. So you basically have to build what is called a minimum viable product that many of you, I'm sure, already heard about it. It's a very small set of features that is on one side complete enough to prove that it works. So I don't know, like I have an app for finding dentists online, right? There must be at least an app that lets you at least find some dentists, right? But at the same time, you need to keep complexity as low as possible, because if you write like the Titanic, and then in the end, you discover pretty soon that you had a wrong idea, and you made some wrong assumptions, you have to throw everything away. And you basically lost quite some time, some money, investors are quite angry, so you don't want to be in that kind of situation. And I like to think of this problem, this minimum viable product, as in math terms. So you have a problem that is you have to minimize something, in this case the effort, and you are constrained, on the other hand, by the fact that you have to still prove that someone out there cares about your product. And this basically means two things. We have a constraint, and we have a minimization problem. So the constraint is the specifications. So app, dentists, online, whatever, right? And this is like responsibility for the product team. So you as a founder, you gather inside the room, and at some point you decide that you want to try to target a certain market with a certain solution. Now, how do you do that? Which kind of technologies are you going to use? And this is the minimization part. And this is the duty of CTOs. This is the duty of the tech team. The tech team takes the specifications and tries to basically accomplish them with as little effort and as fast as possible. So we don't care about specifications. We want to talk about technology. So let's assume that the constraint is a given. Okay, we have the best founder, co-founder, CEO, whatever in the world along, close to us. So specifications are great. Now we care about making them as lean as possible. So we want to minimize whatever is coming from the product team. Now, I basically tried to write down these 3 principles that can be discussed. They are my opinion, but I believe that they can be like a good groundwork for CTOs. I mean, CTOs of startups, of course. First, you as a startup founder, first-time startup founder in charge of the technology, you should minimize code repositories as much as you can. I'm gonna go in detail in a minute about that. Secondly, you should minimize the amount of code that is not directly visible to the user. Not a sound engineering principle, I know, but it's quite a good mental shortcut. And finally, what you really care about, truly, in the end, are metrics, are analytics, are numbers. So, as much as you need them, you can basically ignore the first 2 principles. First, minimize code repositories. That is the same to say, centralize your tech stack. What it means? It means that if you have multiple code repositories out there, it means that you have multiple developers. It means that you have different specialized teams that are working on different stuff, like an iOS native client, an Android native client. Well, we also want to have like a desktop client, native one and web one, and so on and so forth. In the back, we have the back end, and this creates a lot of problems because you have to coordinate people together. You have a lot of management boilerplate, like really a lot of management costs, and you have a lot of sunk costs because I mean this is a quite well-known principle in management theory. Mentally, we as humans, we really want to avoid losses. We hate them. So if you build a huge whatever, like you made a huge investment, and then you discover that that investment was completely useless, you mentally will start thinking about ways to make that investment not useless. So let's try to, I don't know, use that in another way. And this is completely crazy and should be avoided, but we as humans are quite, sometimes we fall in this trap. So if you avoid making huge investments, that's good. In the end, the point is that you want to have multiple platforms that are supported, like both Android and iOS, for instance, because you want to improve your reach. You want to reach more users. And more users means more growth, more metrics, more traction, more investors. Unfortunately, on the other hand, you have a huge cost increase. And in the end, it doesn't make sense. In the end, the trade-off is not worth it. So you should try to minimize the number of code repositories in your product, which means go cross-platform. And secondly, I know this can sound crazy, but if you can avoid even having a backend, I mean, there are great solutions that came up in the last few years. We will go through them later, but just for instance, like Firebase Cloud Functions, sometimes they're enough, right? You have just to push some notifications and whatever, but that's fine, okay? If you can avoid a backend, that's fine, that's great. Secondly, minimize the code that is not visible to users, which mean basically, I mean, that's just a mental shortcut, but in the end it means you should be prioritizing fast deploys over your ability to scale. I mean, invisible code, we all know that, it's basically meant to let us scale. In the past, it was, I mean, just not talking about code, but in the past, why you did want to have like huge servers? Now they are irrelevant. We have AWS and Google Cloud, and I mean, DigitalOcean, all of them. But in the past, you wanted to have like huge investment of invisible stuff to the user just because you wanted to scale. That's the same principle. You don't want to scale. You want to go fast. So scale-related things should be deprioritized. It means like continuous integration, even documentation that is just a coordination tool. Management, really, I mean, forget about it. You're just a few guys inside a room discussing, and that's it. Because what you really care about is changing your product as fast as possible without making much, investment beforehand. A good, corollary to this point is outsourcing everything you can. I mean, yes, sure, it's not nice to do some kind of customer feedback, whatever, using a Typeform. You are not even paying Typeform, so you have that huge, brand of Typeform or Google Form, whatever. And it's not nice, but the story and the truth is that people don't really care about your brand. There's not even a brand, per se. So, who cares? Use off-the-shelf tools as much as you can without going in-house. It's true, you're giving up control. Probably Firebase authentication means, giving everything to Google. Fine. In this case, you don't really care because in 3 months, you're going to be dead. So, who cares, right? Finally, you just really need numbers. You want to go to an investor meeting saying, look, I had this idea, this was the market, and so on and so forth. An investor is like, sure, great. But you can actually, is this actually working? And you show numbers. You show monthly active users, you show retention curves, you show a bunch of stuff. And sometimes tools that are outsourced cannot provide that kind of numbers to investors. Because usually these are tools that are super generic, right? And maybe you have this kind of very peculiar product that needs some very specific numbers. In this case, you can totally make an exception. You have to make an exception because in the end, this is your final goal. Trying to figure out some numbers that can make things basically easier to explain to investors. So, in the end, it all comes down to this concept. When you start building a product and when you start launching a startup, what you really should prioritize is being fast over your ability to scale. And in my opinion, this is not enough discussed in the tech community because this is not usually the use case of technologies. Usually technologies are thought for very complex products that are used by millions of people, while you actually care about tens of people, maybe hundreds. And in the end, this translates to having maybe no backend even at all, having one single code base for the client, outsourcing as much as you can, and finally removing all the management that you can possibly can. And this translates to, finally, we end up where we began, to Google. Why is Google so startup friendly? Because in my opinion, it's the only company now making tools for developers that are really in line with this kind of approach. No backend, as I was talking before. We have Firebase Cloud Functions. We also have Firebase real-time database. It's great. You can really, today, build a full chat without having a backend. This is like nuts. I believe that 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible. But now we can. And actually, it was Google who paved the way for this kind of approach. Fast deploy, Flutter. I believe that you guys have heard about this amazing thing. I really am totally in love with Flutter. More than React Native, to be honest, but that's like my opinion. We had another great talk this morning about this topic. I hope that you follow that. But in the end, the idea is that, again, Google is trying to push for this kind of approach. Less useless stuff, more going to the substance. Outsourcing, again, Firebase authentication lets you, handle all the authentication part. You don't have to integrate any kind of oath, patterns, or whatever. You just integrate their SDK and you're good to go. As well as for Firebase Analytics. You don't have to write everything from scratch. You just integrate their SDK and you're good to go. And remove management. I know that this can feel kind of stretched, but to me, even design at the very, very beginning of a product, it's useless because we already have great design guidelines. Material design is there to help us. We don't really have to reinvent the wheel from all over again. We can have the buttons that are provided by Google or provided by Apple. One thing that actually I like a lot about Flutter is that Google, after trying to push for material design to iOS devices when they released the material design a few years ago, they really tried. And in the end, they gave up, and now Flutter is having Google-style guidelines in terms of design on Android, while on Flutter for iOS, we have Cupertino style. So they basically said, we don't really care about design, we just care that you do your stuff. And I'm totally in love with this kind of approach, and I believe that any kind of CTO launching a startup should go for this kind of way of handling things. Let's say that you are a native developer. Why then? Why I am so angry against a native development? Just to be totally honest, the title of this talk was kind of clickbaity, probably. But in the end, I truly believe that native development should, as an industry, be discarded moving forward. There are many different solutions to native development, alternative solutions to native development. In the end, I see that from a management standpoint, and native development just costs. And it drives me crazy. Like, you have a set of developers that are doing the same thing, really copy, paste, but then you have to adapt it, because the APIs that you have on Android are different from the APIs that you have on iOS. And sometimes you cannot even do some stuff. On Android, you can access the call logs. On iOS, you have call kit, but then in the end, you cannot really do that. So you have to take the same product and adapt it both in terms of infrastructure and graphic UI. Then you have sometimes even to consolidate different metrics. You have usage metrics coming from iOS, and metrics coming from the web, and metrics coming from other clients, and you have to consolidate them, and then you have to take into account attribution. Users are coming from the web, and you can track them using Google Analytics and a query string parameter. But then you cannot do that on native mobile platforms. So in the end, it's really a mess, and if you are a startup, you cannot lose time thinking about this kind of stuff. In the end, the scale opportunity, proving you can scale, has some benefit with investors, but the cost is too much. It outweighs it. So, too long didn't read, you fall asleep, just wake up now. You are kickstarting your own startup, then go for Flutter, then go for Firebase, and you're good to go. Also, remember to include the Firebase Analytics, please. That is like the summarization of the talk. Tech debt. Now, this is quite, a very important point to be raised. Because usually when you are doing fundraising, let's say that you are a bunch of friends, you code this MVP, it works, people are downloading your app or are visiting and signing up to your website or whatever, right? They're using your product. Fine. Then you join, an acceleration program, and then you raise some money and you raised, a few 100,000 euros. Great. And you're still using the same architecture. You're still, relying on Flutter and on Firebase authentication and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, at some point, you are expected to scale, and you are expected to do that quite soon, sooner than you are actually, you're expected to do. So as CTO, you have to strongly communicate with the other part of the management that, usually can't really, understand deeply technical matters, because basically you can expect to rewrite everything from scratch, or at least to, do some very heavy refactoring. And this is, technical debt that in the end has to be taken into account. That's why, startups are always a mess. you are reading about them and they are great on paper, and then you read some, off topics, just stolen remarks from ex-employees, and they're always saying it was a nightmare. We didn't know what we were doing at any point. And that's because of this reason, because at any point you are pushed to be hyper-scaled, and you are constantly rewriting everything according to your plan. What I wanted to leave you with are core concepts. The MVP is, in the end, the technical answer to the question, can this actually work? You have a great idea, fine. You devised a new framework that you expect every developer in the world to use. Great. Can this actually work? This is the job of the MVP is to answer to such questions. Then, after the MVP, that's the seed stage, and that's another kind of question. Can this scale? Yes, it works. Great. Can you take these hundreds of users and make them 1 million? This is, no easy task. And this is another kind of question that you have to make sure your technology, your tech stack, can actually, pull this off. As CTOs, you have to make sure that the tech strategy, your tech stack in terms of product, can follow the fundraising, the management part. I believe that a very frequent and easy to make mistake is to put technology before the product, to put technology before the business, before the fundraising, before the strategy. And I myself made this error plenty of times. It's very easy. But unfortunately, we are like, we need to take into account strategy first, what it's needed for the company first, and then later on you have the technology that follows along. And this is, I believe, the most important thing that any startup founder that wants to be a CTO should take with him. And that's something that I spent quite some time before actually, having this with me like on a deep level. I believe that that's it. Any questions? Yes.
From a less techy point of view, what do you think about incubators? Is the option of going on by yourself a viable option?
About incubators. So, incubators and accelerators, the two things, the two terms are always used as synonyms. I believe that in the past they were super, like all over the world. We had H-Farm, who had an incubator program or accelerator, I cannot remember. But anyway, they invested in startups at some point in the past. As well as here in this region, we had M31, I guess. At some point, they were investing as well in hardware startups. In my opinion, accelerators were great, but their business model couldn't work. So now we don't see many of them, to be honest. I believe that, many just failed. Some of them didn't admit they failed, and they just pivoted and hoped that no one, noticed. Others were pretty honest about that. I joined an incubator, for instance, and my incubator failed. They pivoted to doing, later stage startups, investments. In the end, I believe that if the incubator is a serious one, it's totally worth it, because no one really is teaching this kind of stuff but incubators. But at the same time, it's not easy to find a good one. Not anymore, at least. And it's getting so difficult to get into one. Very good. I'm not talking, for sure, you are all aware about Y Combinator or 500 Startups, the kind of legendary incubators. And it's almost impossible to go there, but not even, our local ones they are super difficult to get in, and I'm not so sure about their quality, to be honest. But if you can find a good one, I think it's great. Yes?
So, what do you think an incubator, what characteristics it must have to be an incubator? There is public incubator, private incubator, like M31, you say?
Yeah.
So,
how to choose one? That's the question. How to choose an incubator? I would look the first and probably only metrics that should be taken into account is their portfolio. So what past startups that has been incubated in an incubator, for instance, or an accelerator, how did they perform? And specifically how much they raised before, after the incubation program. So you take like all the startups that went through that kind of program and you just stalk them. You just go to crunchbase.com basically, and you try to see first if they actually have a Crunchbase page. Because if they don't, that's a very bad sign. Secondly, how much did they raise after the incubation program? Usually, I mean, take this with a grain of salt, but usually after an acceleration program, you should raise at least 200,000–300,000 euros in Europe, I mean, South Europe, at least. And if you go through an incubator and no one, I mean, and I'm seeing a lot of them, no one raises about, no one is able to raise more money after the incubation, and they are just doing, I don't know, whatever. They're just surviving, I guess. That's a bad sign. That would be my first, actually only metric, because everything else is already incorporated in a metric. It's like a good proxy.
And so, about this,
yeah.
You say you have to gain a certain amount of money, at least, to say this is good incubator, but maybe we are not considering that the problem could be our idea. I mean, maybe an incubator thinks, oh, this is a good idea, you can make a lot of money,
yeah.
But maybe there is something wrong.
Yeah, and you failed, yeah, sure. Okay. Absolutely. No, I mean, the ratio of startups failing about right after an acceleration, for instance, is not a bad metric per se. Like, for instance, let's assume that I'm setting up an incubator, right, tomorrow. And I vet some application and I let in 10 startups. And 5 of them after my program are dead, right? Fine, totally fine. The other 5, what did they do? Did they raise money? Or they are like, I don't know, doing whatever. That's the key thing. What is completely misunderstood about startups as a term is that startups are meant to scale. And they can scale with foreign money, with outsiders' money. You don't do that, you cannot scale, really. I mean, there are a few, very few peculiar exceptions, but they are not so frequent. I mean, if you take a look at any kind of company that you think of as a great tech company, they all raised money, all of them. Like even Apple, even Microsoft raised some money at some point. Even though they were profitable, because that's like the model of hyperscaling. That's a very peculiar way of seeing, you know, how companies are built. If you are an accelerator and you self-brand yourself as an accelerator, then what I take is that you want your startups to scale. Otherwise, you lose money, because usually the business model of incubators is taking a part of your company, right? Equity. And how do they make money? If you sell. But how can you sell? You sell only if you get to the point when you are mature enough to be sold to someone who wants to buy you. And you can get to the point through money. That's in the end, like, that's the reason why in the end it's the only metric that matters, to me at least. I mean, that's my opinion. You can hear different points of view, for sure. That's just my way of looking at things. Anyone else? I expected more questions, but maybe I completely knocked you off. Okay, in case you can find me, probably it's there. Yeah, it's here in the middle. Twitter, Google, LinkedIn, whatever. So if you have any more questions, just let me know. Thank you.